The same people who told me I was too old to start over were sitting across from me at a long conference table, smiling like we were old friends catching up after the holidays. My son, Richard, had his hands folded. My daughter-in-law, Patrice, had her reading glasses perched low on her nose like she was already reviewing documents that belonged to her. And my grandson, Trevor, sat at the far end scrolling his phone, bored, as if the entire thing were already decided. They looked comfortable, that was the word, comfortable in a room that was supposed to be about grief. My name is Dorothy Mae Ellison. I am 61 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was told, quietly, persistently, in ways that never required anyone to raise their voice, that I was the family's weak link. Not anymore. I grew up in Ashford, Georgia, a small town that smelled like pine trees and red clay, where everybody knew your name and half of them had an opinion about your business. My father, Harold Ellison, built his lumber company from almost nothing. He was a quiet man, big hands, calloused palms, a man who never said more than he needed to, but when he spoke, people listened. My older brother, Richard, was the heir apparent from the moment he could walk. My father looked at Richard the way some men look at their retirement plan, with relief and pride and a certainty that the future was secured. Richard was loud where my father was quiet, brash where my father was measured, but none of that mattered because Richard wore confidence like a tailored suit, and in Ashford, confidence was currency. I was the other one. Not the disappointing one, not the bad one, just the other one. The one who read too many books, the one who asked too many questions on Sunday dinner, the one my mother would smile at gently and say, "Dorothy, you think too hard, sweetheart," like thinking were a character flaw. When I was 34, not 18, not a young woman just starting out, but 34, a grown adult with 22 years of working in my father's company, with a divorce behind me and 2 grown children of my own, my father called me into his office and told me, calmly, that he was restructuring. Restructuring, that was the word he used. Richard would be taking over day-to-day operations. I would be reassigned to a consulting role, which meant in plain English, I would be paid a fraction of my salary to be present without having any authority whatsoever. My input would be welcome, of course. They just wouldn't be obligated to use it. I sat in that chair across from my father, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break, not shatter, shift, like a foundation settling after a long rain. "Is this because of the divorce?" I asked quietly. My father looked at his desk. "This is about what's best for the company, Dorothy." He never answered the question. He didn't have to. I understood. I had always been a temporary arrangement in a permanent institution. My grandfather, James Monroe Ellison, was 81 years old and still sharp enough to notice things most people missed. He had founded the original Ellison Timber decades before my father expanded it. He had survived the Great Depression, 2 wars, and 3 heart attacks. He outlived 1 wife and chose not to remarry, saying once that grief was private and nobody else's business. He was not a warm man in the traditional sense. He didn't hug freely or compliment easily, but he was fair, relentlessly, uncomplicatedly fair, in a way that felt almost radical in our family. When my father restructured my role, it was Grandpa James who called me first. "Come sit with me," he said over the phone. Just that, no explanation. I drove to his house outside of town, an old farmhouse with a wide porch and a rocking chair he'd sat in for 40 years, and found him waiting with 2 cups of coffee already poured. He didn't ask what happened, he already knew. "Your father means well," he said after a long silence, "but meaning well and doing right aren't the same thing. Never have been." That was it. No speeches, no promises, just truth, delivered plainly the way he delivered everything. Over the next 27 years, Grandpa James became the person I called when I needed to think out loud. He listened in a way nobody else did, not passively, but with full attention, like your words mattered enough to be held carefully before responded to. He watched me build a small consulting business of my own after I eventually left the family company. He watched me raise my children without much help. He watched me fail at things and start over and fail again and keep going. And sometimes, sitting across from him on that old porch, I'd catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not pity, not nostalgia, something more deliberate, like a man reviewing a decision he'd already made and finding it confirmed. I thought he was just an old man watching the years pass. I had no idea he was writing. Grandpa James died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, in his own bed, the way he would have wanted. He was 94. He had been slowing down for 2 years, but even then, even with the oxygen tank and the walker and the nurse that came twice a week, he remained entirely himself, alert, deliberate, present. I held his hand the last time I visited, 4 days before he passed. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "You always knew what mattered, Dorothy. You just didn't always believe you were allowed to." I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just held his hand until he fell asleep. The lawyer called on a Thursday. His name was Gerald Watts, a composed man from Savannah who had been managing Grandpa James's estate affairs for 15 years. His voice was careful and formal, the way lawyers' voices get when they are delivering information that will change things. "Mr. Ellison, your grandfather was very specific in his final arrangements. He asked that you be present for the reading of his will. There are provisions that concern you directly." I told myself not to read anything into it. A keepsake, maybe. Some of his books, the old chess set he kept in the study. I had long since made peace with the idea that the Ellison family fortune would pass through Richard, as everything always had. I put on a black dress and drove to Savannah. Richard and Patrice arrived before me. Of course they did. They were always early to things they expected to profit from. Richard stood when I walked in, smiled broadly, and clapped me on the shoulder, like you might greet a pleasant acquaintance at a company event. "Dorothy," he said warmly, "good to see you." Like it hadn't been 3 years since we'd spoken at length, like the last conversation we'd had wasn't an argument over whether I deserved to be included in a family meeting about our father's medical decisions. Patrice touched my arm gently. "This must be so hard for you," she said softly. "He loved you so much." I nodded and took my seat. Trevor, their son, was on his phone. He didn't look up. He was 32, handsome in the way of men who have never had to work very hard for anything, and he had his father's same easy confidence. His presence at the table told me everything about what they expected to happen. Gerald Watts entered at precisely 10 o'clock, set his briefcase on the table, opened it without ceremony.
He read through the standard language first, the property inventories, the accounts, the valuation summaries, numbers that registered as abstract until they didn't. The Ellison Timber Company, the farmhouse, the land holdings in 3 counties, the investment portfolios. When Gerald read the total, $4.2 billion, Richard exhaled slowly beside me, and I watched his jaw relax, the way a man's jaw relaxes when he hears a number he's been calculating in his head for years and finds the reality slightly better than expected. Then Gerald paused. He turned a page. He looked up briefly, at me specifically, and then returned his eyes to the document. "Per the wishes of James Monroe Ellison," Gerald read carefully, "the entirety of his estate, including all holdings, assets, properties, and investments valued at approximately $4.2 billion, is to be transferred in full to his granddaughter, Dorothy Mae Ellison." The room went absolutely silent. Not the polite kind of silence, the kind that comes when something has been detonated and the sound hasn't caught up with the impact yet. Richard turned to look at me. Patrice's hand went still on the table. Trevor finally put down his phone. Richard recovered first. That was always his gift, the ability to absorb a shock and rearrange his face around it faster than most people could blink. "Well," he said, with a measured generosity, "that makes a certain sense. Dorothy was always close to Grandpa James." Close. Like closeness were a technicality, like what had just happened were simply a logistical outcome he was willing to accommodate. Patrice leaned toward me and lowered her voice. Of course, sweetheart, we'll want to help you manage this properly. This kind of estate, it needs experienced hands. She smiled warmly, the smile of a woman who had been rehearsing this moment. Richard nodded, smoothing his tie. She's right, Dorothy. You've been running a small consulting operation. That's wonderful. It is. But this is a different world. Corporate governance, investment strategy, legacy management. We'll set up a family trust. Keep it all together, the way Grandpa James would have wanted. The way Grandpa James would have wanted, from the man who had not visited Grandpa James once in the final 14 months of his life. Trevor spoke for the first time. No offense, Aunt Dorothy, but this is a billion-dollar operation. This isn't the kind of thing you figure out as you go. I looked at him. No offense taken, I said quietly. I kept my hands still. I kept my voice even. Because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Gerald Watts had not finished reading. If I may continue, Gerald said. Richard waved a generous hand. Of course, the formalities. Gerald looked down. Mr. Ellison included an addendum to this will, a personal letter written in his own hand, notarized and legally incorporated as part of the estate documentation. He requested that it be read aloud in full in the presence of all parties. The room shifted. Richard straightened. Patrice's hand went still on the table. Trevor finally put down his phone. Gerald cleared his throat. To my family, I'm writing this letter because I'm old enough to know that what people say at a funeral is rarely what happened, and I want the record to reflect what actually happened. 50 years ago, I built Ellison Timber with my hands. I've watched it grow into something I could not have imagined. I've also watched my family use that growth to justify cruelty they dressed up as practicality. My son Harold is a good man in the ways that matter least and a poor man in the ways that matter most. He cut his daughter out of her rightful place in this company when she was 34 years old, not because she lacked capability, she had more capability than anyone at that table, but because her divorce made her inconvenient, and inconvenient people make powerful men uncomfortable. Richard's face had gone the color of old chalk. Gerald continued. Dorothy did not ask me to fix it. She never asked me for anything she hadn't earned. She simply kept going. She built a life without the advantages she was entitled to, and she did it without bitterness, which is more grace than this family deserved from her. I am leaving my estate in full because she has proven, without any help from us, that she understands what this company was built on. Not confidence, not connections, not the comfort of knowing your family would catch you if you fell. Hard work, dignity, and the ability to look at something clearly without flinching. To Richard, you were given everything, and you still couldn't be generous. That is a poverty no inheritance can fix. To Patrice, you married into this family and learned its worst habits faster than anyone I've ever watched. To Trevor, you still have time to choose differently. I hope you use it. And to Dorothy, you were never the weak one. You were the only one who didn't need to be. I am sorry it took me this long to say so in a room where everyone had to hear it. With love, and with my eyes open, James Monroe Ellison. Gerald closed the document.
The silence that followed was not the same silence as before. This one had weight to it. This one had the particular quality of things that cannot be unsaid. Richard stood up first. This is unconscionable, he said, his voice tight. He was 94 years old. He was medicated. He was influenced. By whom? I asked. He looked at me. Dorothy, I am not doing this here. He named you specifically, Richard. He named all of you, by name, with clear language, notarized. I kept my voice level. A 94-year-old man sat down, organized his thoughts, and wrote the truth. You're welcome to challenge it, but you'll be challenging a dead man's words in public,
and everyone in Ashford is going to read every word of that letter." Patrice touched Richard's arm. He pulled away from her. Gerald spoke. "The provisions of this will include explicit protections against interference, contestation, or attempts to establish external management over Miss Ellison's inherited estate. Any such actions will trigger automatic legal consequences, including full public disclosure of the letter's contents and the forfeiture of any residual bequests named elsewhere in the document." "Residual bequests," Richard repeated slowly. "Your grandfather left modest accounts for you, your wife, and your son," Gerald said evenly, "contingent on compliance with the will's terms. Any legal challenge voids those accounts entirely." Trevor looked up. Something moved across his face. Not anger, something more like reckoning. Richard sat back down slowly. Patrice opened her mouth and closed it again. And just like that, it was over. Ashford is a small town. Grandpa James knew that when he wrote the letter. He knew that Gerald Watts would be present. He knew that 3 people in that room would carry those words back into a community where the Ellison name had meant something for 60 years. The letter became the worst-kept secret in 3 counties within a month. People who had smiled at Richard and Patrice at every charity function and church social and town hall meeting quietly reassembled their understanding of who those people were. Not dramatically, not publicly, but in the way small towns rearrange themselves around new information. Gradually, thoroughly, without announcement. Richard's real estate development business began losing partners. Patrice's name was removed from the hospital gala committee after a vote that was never publicized but was widely understood. Trevor, to his small credit, called me 6 weeks after the reading. "I didn't know about any of it, what they did to you with the company. I didn't know." I believed him. He was young when it happened, and Grandpa James said he still had time. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry," he said. That was the first genuine apology anyone in that family had ever offered me. It came from the youngest one, the one everyone had counted on to follow the pattern. Sometimes the pattern breaks in unexpected places. I did not change my life overnight. I did not move into a larger house immediately or acquire things I hadn't needed the week before. I sat with it. I hired good people, a financial team, a legal team, a management structure for the timber company that reflected the values I had always believed it should be run by. I gave the workers at the Ashford Mill a raise that was 17 years overdue. I funded a scholarship at the county high school in Grandpa James's name. I called my own children, who had watched me struggle for years, and told them we were going to be all right. That phone call was the best moment of all of it, better than the courtroom, better than watching Richard's expression collapse. The sound of my daughter crying with relief on the other end of the line, that was the moment I understood what Grandpa James actually gave me. Not power, not revenge, not even justice, though it felt close to that. He gave me proof that had been missing from my life for decades, the simple, irrefutable, publicly recorded proof that I had always been enough, that the person who got pushed to the margins had been the one worth watching all along, that the quiet ones, the observant ones, the ones who keep going without the applause, sometimes the story ends with them standing at the center of the room. I drove past my father's old office building a few months later. It was smaller than I remembered. Most things are, when you stop needing them to define you. I didn't stop the car. I had somewhere to be. People ask me sometimes whether I'm angry, whether I wish things had been different, whether I hold any of it against them. The honest answer is no, not because I've forgotten, not because it didn't hurt, but because the person I became was built from exactly the life I was forced to live, and I happened to like her.
I happen to think she's worth more than the version of me that would have existed if everything had been handed over easily. Grandpa James used to say, "The people who underestimate you are doing you a favor. They leave you alone long enough to become exactly who you were always going to be." I am 61 years old. I run a $4 billion company. I do it the way he taught me, quietly, deliberately, with my eyes open. And every single day, I am grateful that they never believed in me. Because if they had, I might have believed in them instead.